In the Mediterranean, the number of migrant crossings to Europe is higher than it has been in years. So far, this year, more than 140,000 people have survived the perilous journey. An unknown number have died. One hotspot for country departures is Tunisia. From there, the journey usually goes to the Italian islands of either Lampedusa or Sicily. The EU has pledged hundreds of millions of euros to help the Tunisian government to stop people from making this crossing. But so far, that's without much effect. DW's Jan-Philip Schultz and Mabrouka Kedir report now from Sfax in Tunisia, which is at the forefront of the migrant departures.
Noureddin Lewabi has been fishing out of this harbor near Sfax for more than 20 years. He says things changed this spring. That's when they started seeing boats full of people heading for Europe. When the weather's bad, the fishermen try to warn them to turn back. But, he says, they hardly ever do.
We keep finding bodies in the sea. They get tangled in our fishing nets. We call the Coast Guard when that happens. You can't work like that. It is awful. They are people just like us.
Most of the people who try to cross the Mediterranean to get to Europe set off from this region. More than 2,000 people are known to have died in the attempt. Sometimes local authorities have trouble collecting all the bodies that wash up on the beach. Along the coast, thousands of people wait for their place on a boat. Susud Sangne is from Burkina Faso. He knows how dangerous it is, but says he's determined to try to get to Europe. He says he's good at repairing electrical appliances.
My only hope is to get across this sea to Europe. I'm doing everything for my mum. I want her to be a bit happy for the first time in her life.
When boats sink, the Coast Guard often brings survivors to this hospital. Dr. Rabia Hamdawi says recently it's felt like a war zone.
We simply get too many people coming at once. We don't have enough doctors and nurses to take care of everyone. We are short of everything, medicines and equipment. It's more than we can manage.
For those whose plans are still intact, the focus is on preparation and securing a spot on a boat. The smuggler networks which stretch across the region have arrived here in Sfax. One smuggler is prepared to talk to us, as long as we don't film his face.
I only do the job to make money. Everyone wants to make lots of money. We take the migrants to Europe. What they do next is up to them.
Often they'll squeeze 40 people into a small boat. A trip like that would earn them around 40,000 euros. They're not the only ones profiting.
Our people control the whole beach area. Some of our guys have direct connections with the regional security forces. They will tell us when it's safe for a crossing. We pay up to 10,000 euros for this service.
Susud doesn't care who profits from his trip. He still has to earn a few hundred euros with odd jobs in Sfax. Then he'll have enough to get on a boat and take his chances.
And DW's Christine Mundwa joins us now from Brussels, where she's following these developments. Christine, the EU has agreed to pay Tunisia to help stop migration. How is that deal meant to work?
Sarah, in the recent years, Tunisia has become a real focal point, as you saw in the report there, where migrants are taking off to head to Europe. And so EU leaders have directed some 1 billion euros in a memorandum of understanding, the idea being to really help the Tunisian officials crack down on the criminal gangs and the smuggling networks there. So a similar deal was struck with Niger a few years ago, and what that really entailed was empowering security forces on the ground to stop people making those crossings, seizing the assets. These are pickup trucks and other assets that the criminal gangs use to facilitate these crossings, really breaking down those networks. And also EU money going to people who have been working in the smuggling business, compensating them and encouraging them to pursue other business ventures, because it is, of course, a very lucrative business. As we're understanding in Tunisia right now, it's even cheaper for migrants to pay for a crossing because there are just so many smuggling networks offering this service. So this deal, from a European perspective, works really well because I pointed out the Niger agreement. You do see a decrease in those numbers, so it's effective from that front. And if you listen to the Italian Prime Minister, for example, she says this is the way to do it. We've got to go to the hotspots, strike deals there, and stop people from making their way to Europe because we're not able to agree on what to do with people once they get to Europe. But, of course, rights groups will point out that these deals have been struck with countries that have, let's just say, difficult human rights records, and so they remain controversial in that sense.
And how about other options, Christine? I mean, in its effort to curb illegal migration, does the EU have any other alternatives other than to pay Tunisia and Turkey to hold migrants back?
Well, in June, the European Union took a step closer to agreeing on a migration deal. This has been a very contentious issue. The European Union member states have not been able to agree on how to deal with migration. So what you have is you have the reception countries, the border countries. These are your Italys, your Greeces, who say they are overwhelmed with the burden and that they want to be able to share migrants within the bloc. Of course, you've got inland countries that are further up north, who don't want to take people. So they struck some kind of a compromise. It's not yet been fully agreed upon, but it suggests or it proposes that countries that don't want to take on their share of the burden, so to say, quote unquote, that they would have to pay something close to 20,000 euro per migrant that they don't want to take. So this is not something that they've quite agreed on. Even that is contentious, but this is the challenge. And this is why you hear voices from like your Giorgia Meloni, the Prime Minister of Italy, saying we're struggling to reach consensus here. Let's go to the countries where the problem is and let's deal with the challenge from where it is there.
Christine Mundwa in Brussels, thank you.
Well, to talk some more about this, we're joined by Michelle Parch, a professor in global studies at Roskilde University in Denmark. Good to see you again. The European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has promised €1 billion to fight illegal migration. What type of impact do you think that will have?
I think it's important for the EU to have human rights as a central plank in EU policy, and it needs to think differently. So it's important to invest diplomatic and economic capital in making sure that the EU addresses those very abuses that trigger migration in the first instance, rather than entrenching authoritarian regimes.
The EU is facing a massive labour shortage right now as all of this is unfolding. The European Commission says that the situation is actually getting worse. Does it make sense for the EU to protect its borders so robustly at this moment with that in mind?
Not really, because this is actually contrary to a very recent Eurostat report, which, for instance, shows very clearly that the working age population in the whole of the EU is actually declining. And by 2050, we will have a very, very serious shortage. So I think if there is a policy mix and a more holistic approach to combine migration policy with development policy, and really look at ways in which we can make safe and legal pathways for instance, work programs that skill and reskill labor shortage, where areas like the care industry, there's a shortage of 400,000 truck drivers across the whole of the EU, but also in green technology, because the EU is also bound to actually meet its own targets. And these are areas where all the African labor migrants can actually be made having a legal pathway to come here, and also the EU will benefit itself to reach its own targets. And we have to also remember that once labour migrants send remittances back home, this will be much better than any policy that is trying to reduce poverty.
As we heard in the report, 90% of migrants are trying to get to the EU, are desperate enough to pay big money to smugglers. How do you stop such transactions from taking place?
The only way to stop smugglers to carry on with their business is actually to ensure these safe and legal pathways. Nobody would go on a boat and risk their life unless they are really trying to flee from abuse. And we have heard, instances of the EU actually normalizing violence through some of the migration deals we have been having. So I think to actually focus on talent partnerships and to actually learn lessons from the likes of Germany, that has an own commissioner now working on migration policy that works closely with the Ghanaian officials to protect the way we have legal and safe pathways for labour migrants that can fill the gaps in our own labour shortage areas. And this is something that Spain is doing with Morocco, and we also have France having a very pragmatic and realistic approach to this. But this requires a long-term vision rather than this short-sightedness that we have with these deals.
Michelle Patch, Professor in Global Studies at Roskilde University in Denmark. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.